An unprecedented constitutional crisis has erupted behind the sealed oak doors of Buckingham Palace. What was staged as a routine gathering of the sovereign house has descended into a dark seizure of operational power, a silent shift in authority that threatens to rewrite the hierarchy of the monarchy forever. Confidential sources inside the royal household speak of urgent emergency sessions, trembling hands over historic documents, and an icy confrontation that left Queen Camilla stripped of her long-held influence. The carefully crafted illusion of royal unity has shattered, replaced by an unyielding enforcer, a reluctant future queen, and a monarch forced to choose between the survival of his crown and the peace of his marriage. Peering through the keyhole of history, the true story of this historic power shift can finally be laid bare. The air outside the throne room was thick with a suffocating stillness. Rain lashed against the ancient glass, but inside the grand gallery, the only sound was the faint ticking of a gilded carriage clock. Queen Camilla stood blocking the threshold, her hands trembling against her silk dress, her voice desperate as she made one final plea to stop Catherine, Princess of Wales, from crossing the boundary. Camilla warned that granting Catherine entry at this precise moment was not preparation for future service. It was an explicit, irreversible act of replacement. Beside them, Catherine remained silent, her posture rigid, caught between her deep instinct for duty and the agonizing humiliation of being forced into the center of a brutal succession war she had never asked to lead. Then, Princess Anne stepped forward. The Princess Royal did not raise her voice. Decades of unyielding service had forged her authority out of iron. The moment Camilla begged for a delay, Anne answered with a silence so cold that every courtier and security officer in the corridor understood the judgment had already been passed. Anne turned away from the queen consort, extended her hand toward Catherine, and began the fateful walk that would reshape the monarchy's destiny. Anne informed Camilla with surgical precision that the decision no longer belonged to private pride, personal anxiety, or household intrigue. A confidential royal council, an elite circle of senior family members and key advisors, had already approved the briefing. Catherine was entering the throne room because her future responsibilities beside Prince William demanded immediate access to state intelligence previously restricted to the king alone. What wounded Camilla most was not merely the loss of rank, but the devastating knowledge that her own husband had acted without giving her the power to stop it. Clutched securely in Anne's gloved hand was a crimson leather folder containing the formal written decree setting out the new operational arrangement. Yet one page remained hidden from Camilla's gaze, and the terrifying fear of what was inscribed upon that final sheet proved far more agonizing than the rejection she had just suffered. King Charles had signed the instruction himself, granting Catherine immediate clearance for constitutional emergency planning. By authorizing his sister to act as the sole guardian of this transition, the king built an unbreachable wall around the future queen, ensuring no private appeal could overrule the crown's ultimate survival. As the massive double doors finally creaked open, Catherine walked forward, carrying no expression of triumph, only the immense weight of the heavy responsibilities waiting beyond the threshold. Behind them, Camilla stood motionless in the shadow of the archway, her eyes wide with the realization that this was not a sudden act of support for the younger princess. It was pure, deliberate enforcement. Someone inside the palace had painstakingly prepared this moment, built an airtight case, secured the king's definitive signature, and selected Princess Anne as the one person powerful enough to carry out the execution. To understand how the House of Windsor reached this point of no return, one must gaze into the hidden wounds, private fears, and conflicting loyalties of the three women who hold the destiny of the realm in their hands. At the core of this elite intrigue stand three distinct royal figures facing vastly different realities. Camilla, driven by deep-seated paranoia, fought frantically against the looming threat of being pushed to the outer edges of a reign she had spent decades struggling to reach. Catherine, disciplined and protective of the institution, feared becoming the very symbol of another woman's public defeat, telling Prince William in confidence that she wished for no one to be diminished in her name. And Anne, bound by an unwavering oath to the crown, faced the most heartbreaking choice of all, sacrificing household harmony to protect the realm from a catastrophic internal fracture.
As the silent war spilled out into the very heart of sovereign power, the machinery of the monarchy was set in motion, leaving no room for retreat. To truly comprehend the violent fracture that played out before the throne room, one must peer backward through the polished corridors of the palace to a moment weeks earlier, a meticulously orchestrated humiliation designed to shatter Catherine's standing before the eyes of the court. It happened beneath the vaulted ceilings during the rehearsal for the Commonwealth service, a high-stakes ritual where every movement, seating chart, and procession order dictates the fragile hierarchy of power. In the hyper-controlled ecosystem of the monarchy, physical proximity to the sovereign is currency.
When a revised placement card was covertly slipped into the hands of senior household officials just minutes before the rehearsal, it was not merely a scheduling adjustment. It was an act of quiet political execution. Camilla's private approval was stamped across the directive, systematically pushing the future queen several rows back and stripping her of a vital briefing personally assigned by the king himself. Catherine stood in the hushed gallery, feeling the sudden, chilling shift in the room's atmosphere. She did not raise her voice, nor did she appeal to the nearest guard for protection. Instead, with agonizing self-control, she folded the original placement card in half, slid it smoothly into her handbag, and locked her expression into a mask of serene indifference. But the calculated insult did not go unseen. Princess Anne, standing in the shadows near the carved stone pillars, watched the maneuver with eyes hardened by decades of observing court intrigue. For months, the Princess Royal had harbored deep suspicions that Camilla's office was quietly tightening a noose around the younger royal's preparation. But this blatant act of insubordination crossed the boundary from petty rivalry into treasonous operational interference. That evening, the evidence was laid before the king. Anne requested an emergency audience in the monarch's private quarters, placing two contrasting documents side by side on the mahogany desk: the original placement card authorized by Charles and the unauthorized replacement stamped by Camilla's clique. Charles studied the papers in absolute, suffocating silence. The ink was clear, but the implications were darker still. Someone within his own inner circle had bypassed his supreme authority, rewriting state protocols behind his back. The silence in the royal study carried not only profound anger, but the deep, corrosive shame of a sovereign realizing his household had slipped beyond his control. Refusing to let the infraction vanish into palace whispers, Charles authorized Anne to launch a confidential, unsparing review of every administrative change, schedule alteration, and communication log involving the future queen over the preceding 6 months. What the secret audit uncovered sent shockwaves through the upper echelons of the court. It was never a collection of administrative errors, but a systematic, highly coordinated campaign of sabotage. Briefings had been deliberately delayed, internal memos had been diverted, and confidential security summaries intended for Catherine's eyes had vanished into the bureaucratic labyrinth of Camilla's private office. Armed with the irrefutable paper trail, Anne waited for the precise tactical moment to strike. The reckoning arrived in a small, windowless archive room deep within the palace bowels. There were no secretaries, no recording devices, and no courtiers to soften the blow. Anne slammed the dossier of intercepted records onto the table between them and pinned the queen consort with a gaze that brooked no escape. She demanded to know how many times Camilla had deliberately sabotaged the future queen's constitutional training behind the king's back. Camilla attempted to retreat behind the impenetrable shield of palace protocol, stammering frantic justifications about preserving the king's health, protecting public stability, and preventing competing centers of attention from fracturing the realm. But Anne did not blink, did not soften, and refused to let the queen consort hide behind emotional self-defense. Stripped of her titles and prestige in the crucible of that confrontation, Camilla was forced to face the raw, unvarnished truth. Her desperate bid to preserve her supreme dominance had been fully exposed, and the enforcer standing before her would neither forgive nor forget. The atmosphere inside the king's private study was suffused with an oppressive, almost tragic stillness as Charles sat alone before the open crimson folder. The document before him was no mere administrative memo. It was the royal continuity directive, a binding operational order detailing the exact protocols of royal authority during moments of severe sovereign vulnerability, severe illness, or national crisis. To attach his signature to the final page was to grant Catherine, Princess of Wales, unprecedented access to the innermost constitutional mechanisms of the state, effectively crowning her the de facto operational guardian of the monarchy's future. Yet, as the fountain pen hovered above the parchment, Charles recognized the horrific personal toll of his pen stroke. Signing meant publicly protecting the realm while silently delivering a devastating, irreversible blow to his wife, forcing Camilla to confront the brutal truth that her shadow authority had reached its absolute end. It was at that critical, agonizing juncture that Prince William entered the room, his footsteps silent across the heavy carpet, his shadow falling across the monarch's desk. William offered no dramatic theatrics, no bitter accusations. His voice was dangerously low, measured, and absolute. He told his father that Catherine had never sought Camilla's title, nor had she ever wished to be wielded as an instrument against the queen consort. But the future king made his ultimatum starkly clear. Catherine could not protect the future of the crown while being deliberately blindfolded by private jealousy and covert sabotage inside her own household. The long-term stability of their children's future reign and the absolute continuity of the House of Windsor demanded that preparation begin long before crisis arrived. Charles looked down at the parchment once more. He knew Camilla would not view this document as a neutral administrative procedure. She would view it as a heartless rejection from the husband whose throne she had spent a lifetime fighting to stand beside. Yet if he refused, Catherine would be left exposed to continuous covert obstruction. His hand steadying, the king touched the nib to the paper and scribbled his name across the directive, placing the ultimate authority of enforcement directly into the hands of Princess Anne. Then he turned to the terrifying final sheet, a clause stating that all unauthorized interference in Catherine's schedule, access, or ceremonial placement must cease immediately. Any future alterations would require the direct written consent of the monarch. The loop was closed. The secret pathway through which Camilla had wielded her private influence was permanently severed. When the news reached Camilla in her private sitting room, it landed with the devastating force of an executioner's blade. She stared at the copy of the directive placed beside her untouched tea, her face draining of color, her hands trembling as she read the final page twice over. When Charles entered the room later, he did not offer a defense. In a painful confession, the monarch admitted that his lingering hesitation and desire to avoid domestic conflict had allowed a poisonous resentment to fester within the palace walls. But what shattered Camilla entirely was the revelation that Anne's ruthless intervention had been fully backed by the king. The door to the throne room had not just been closed to her influence, it had been bolted from within. Yet the ultimate emotional climax of this silent war did not take place in the presence of kings or enforcers. It occurred behind locked doors in a secluded drawing room, where Catherine and Camilla finally faced each other alone. No aides recorded the exchange. No courtiers stood by to soften the raw, agonizing truth. Camilla stood by the window, her posture defensive, her hands clutching her arms as her eyes searched the young princess for any trace of cruel triumph. Instead, Catherine reached into her handbag, withdrew the folded, altered Westminster placement card, and laid it softly onto the mahogany table between them. "I did not keep this card as evidence of a humiliation," Catherine said, her voice steady, carrying the chilling coldness of absolute restraint. "I kept it as a physical reminder of the kind of leader I will never allow myself to become." Camilla looked down at the creased card, the breath hitching in her throat. For the first time in her long, embattled life, the queen consort dropped her courtly armor. In a voice choked with decades of suppressed insecurity, she confessed the desperate, driving truth behind her sabotage. Every step Catherine took toward power felt like a violent act of her own erasure. She confessed that her position felt smaller, her voice fainter, every time the younger princess entered a room. Fear had convinced her that Catherine's rise was an intentional threat to her survival, driving her to mistake necessary constitutional preparation for a hostile takeover. Catherine did not mock her terror, nor did she offer hollow comfort. Her response was a lethal blade wrapped in velvet. "Dignity is never preserved by taking it from someone else," she replied, her eyes unwavering. "I will accept every duty required to protect my husband's crown, but I will never allow those duties to be turned into weapons against you." Then, Catherine revealed the final, crushing act of mercy, a gesture that cut far deeper than any political defeat. She informed Camilla that she had personally requested the king preserve the queen consort's charitable patronages and public programs intact. Catherine had systematically separated Camilla's genuine service to the nation from the toxic interference exposed by Anne, refusing to dismantle the older woman's legacy merely because fear had corrupted her judgment. Camilla realized with horrifying clarity that the woman she had hunted as a rival had used her moment of absolute victory to save her from total disgrace. Unqualified, broken, and stripped of all defense, the queen consort offered her full apology, accepting the immutable boundary that had been drawn across the royal house forever. When the golden morning light broke over the spires of London, the palace stood quiet, but the monarchy inside its walls had been fundamentally rewired. A singular photograph snapped at dawn, showing Princess Anne walking alongside Catherine toward the throne room, while Camilla stood motionless in the shadowed archway, escaped to the front pages of global press. Without a word of commentary or a public declaration, the world understood that a seismic, irreversible shift had occurred. Authority had moved forward, resistance had frozen in place. The House of Windsor had prepared for its future, not through open warfare, but through an uncompromising enforcement of cold constitutional necessity. Outside Buckingham Palace, thousands gathered under a slate-gray sky, raising newspapers that proclaimed a new era of unyielding order. For Queen Camilla, the new reality was defined by an acute, fatalistic isolation. The phantom influence she had cultivated across decades, the informal channels, the whispered revisions to schedules, the covert pressure on household aides, vanished overnight. Under the terms of the king's signed directive, a rigid administrative chain of command was established. Every schedule change, every ceremonial assignment, and every communication touching upon the Princess of Wales was routed directly through Charles, William, or Anne. Deprived of her shadow networks, Camilla found herself confined strictly to the ceremonial boundaries of her title. She retained her charities, her public patronage, and her seat beside the king. But the operational leverage she had once wielded to shape the court was utterly extinguished. The woman who had fought through decades of public hostility to reach the summit of the realm now discovered the brutal paradox of royal standing. One can wear the crown, yet remain completely powerless within the machine that sustains it. For Catherine, victory brought no joy, no respite, and no sense of personal triumph. Entering the throne room meant crossing a threshold from which there was no return. The briefings she received, detailing state security, continuity protocols during national emergency, and the complex machinery of sovereign succession, placed an unbearable emotional and historical burden upon her shoulders. She was no longer merely a beloved public figure or a supportive spouse. She had been initiated into the dark, relentless core of statecraft. Standing beside Prince William, who watched the transition with grim satisfaction, Catherine understood that the power handed to her was not a reward, but a sentence of absolute dedication. The crown demands the total surrender of individual desire, and in accepting her place within the constitutional engine, she bound herself forever to the cold demands of an institution that consumes all who serve it. In the quiet recesses of the royal apartments, King Charles and Princess Anne shared a silent understanding of what had been accomplished. Charles had spared the institution at the cost of his own domestic tranquility, proving that when forced to choose between personal devotion and the survival of the dynasty, a sovereign must always choose the dynasty. Anne, the silent architect of this ruthless resolution, retreated into her duties without seeking praise or recognition. She had not acted out of personal affection for Catherine or malice toward Camilla. She had acted because the monarchy cannot endure internal sabotage. In the grand narrative of the House of Windsor, Anne proved once more that true loyalty to the throne often requires executing the most painful, merciless decisions so that the crown itself remains unsullied. The history of the British monarchy is written not merely in golden coronations and public celebrations, but in the dark, silent sacrifices made behind velvet curtains. Kings and queens are merely temporary custodians of an ancient, unyielding altar, and those who attempt to weaponize personal fear against the imperative of succession are inevitably crushed beneath its wheels. Queen Camilla stood by her window as the evening mist settled over the palace gardens, watching the shadowed figure of the future queen walk across the courtyard below. The storm had passed, leaving behind a colder, sharper, and far more lethal court, a realm where duty had conquered ambition, and where the crown had proven, as it always has throughout the centuries, that it belongs only to those willing to bear its crushing weight without flinching. If you found this deep dive into royal history and court intrigue compelling, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more breaking analyses and